G'day legends, I hope you're all awesome. We're going to take a look at this 1991-1992 guitar buyer's guide for some gear acquisition syndrome nostalgia. I did a video looking at a bunch of vintage gear catalogs a week, 2 weeks ago. They were sent to me by a viewer, which so many people really seem to enjoy, just kind of going through. I did like an 80s, a 90s, and a few 2000s catalogs in there, just reminiscing about gear and what was available and kind of just comparing not only what was available back then, but kind of what you got for your money. I should mention that I kind of ignored that those old guitar buyer's guides, and this one included, they're going to be the manufacturer's suggested retail price. So street price is always going to be a bit lower. So my incredulous reaction to some of the prices was probably a little bit overstated. I mean, it's YouTube. You got to overstate everything, right? So let's just dig straight into this thing. Look at that. Hendrix Strat on the front cover. That's a little bit different to the 80s version of this because I guess the Fender custom shop stuff probably really started to take off around this time. But before we get to the actual buyer's guide, we get some vintage ads, and I love this one straight away. 57 Strat, 59 Les Paul, 91 Quadreverb GT. That's some audacious marketing there. Anyone who feels their 91 Quadreverb is, as iconic as maybe a 59 Les Paul, weigh in the comment section. But, the Quadreverb is a pretty fun unit. This was like the working man's rack unit, especially as we'll see when we get to some of the prices, where it's easy for people my age to look back at the 80s and just assume everybody had tens of thousands of dollars to have a rack full of Eventides and 2290s. But in reality, you probably had an MP1 and a Quadreverb. And over here, look at this. I always enjoy this ad right here. I endorse the guitar I used to play. I designed this one. Big difference. And I do like this rack of vintage compressors behind Eddie over here. So that's when the Wolfgang was a Music Man guitar. It's funny that it's gone from that to Peavey all the way back around to Fender. What do we have here? Look at this. I want to grab one of these guitars so badly one day. The Ibanez Voyager, designed by Red Beach. If you've got an Ibanez Voyager, let me know in the comments and let me know how you like it. But, it's probably not my favorite guitar design from Ibanez, but I do just kind of like that, there's the cutaway where it is. And I remember seeing a video with Reb talking about putting this kind of scratch plate style thing on there and how nobody liked it. It does look a little bit strange on Koa. I would have figured you want to see that beautiful wood in there, but hey, it was the early 90s. We've got some more stuff over here. What's this? Amp of the Year 91, the Peavey Bravo. I've never heard of the Peavey Bravo. I always think of kind of Peavey solid state amps, and I think of the Peavey Rage. I love this. Mike Soldano and Yamaha. So what was this? The T100C tube amp, the Yamaha T series. I understand these are pretty desirable. I've never played one, but on some of my Soldano videos, I've had people kind of weigh in the comment section and say, hey, if you see one of these Yamaha amps designed by Mike, they're fantastic. And I watched an old rig rundown with Bill Levity from Firehouse, awesome guitar player, awesome band, where they had one of the Yamaha Soldano amps in their rack. So that's pretty cool. Pretty cool to see Mike killing it back then and still killing it today. So here we go. This is the fun, the guitar buyer's guide. And look at this. Look at this insane Alvarez, the scoop. So it scoops completely under the neck. Obviously, you have to hold the neck on somehow. That is something that looks like it was designed just to one up that Stevens extended cutaway on there. I've never played one of these. I have seen old magazines with these in there before. Did anybody actually own one of these back in the day, or was this a gimmick even in the early 90s? So what do we got? We got some Alvarez. I mean, you could get the scoop for $850 $1991, probably a bit cheaper if you actually went into a store. And I guess back then, you could probably walk into a music store with a wad of cash and say, hey, here's some cash, do me a deal, rather than now, like everything's just fixed prices because no one uses cash anymore. Anyway, that's a topic for another day. The Aria Pro 2s. So for an Aria Pro 2, we're looking at $1,200-ish for a Les Paul style thing. I'm curious to contrast that against the price of a Gibson Les Paul. And look at this. Fender kind of, they avoided the Floyd Rose thing for the whole 80s. And then right as the modding your Strat with the Floyd Rose came to an end, they decided to jump on and actually get Floyd involved in there. These are kind of cool ads, though. You can see that whole nostalgic thing that was happening with even like cinema around that time. Dances with Wolves, Legends of the Fall, the kind of afternoon light coming through into the craftsman's workshop. You can see they're really leaning into that. And nowadays, we're just nostalgic for all the neon stuff from the 80s, how things change. And similar thing, that PRS looks absolutely gorgeous. That's still what I think of when I think of PRS guitars. Alrighty, what do we have over here? Blade. I've played a Blade Strat before. That was pretty fantastic. So they were Swiss built, Strat style, 22 fret maple neck, Sperzel tuners. Pretty awesome specs on here. Graphite nut. Yeah. So in the 1600-ish range for that, that's the Model 3, and then the Model 4 is a little bit more. Boland instruments. There's no photos of any of these, but Buscarino. I'm saying that. Apologies to anybody out there with that last name if I'm butchering your last name. I have a last name that's very butcherable as well, so I feel you're right there. Look at this, the Carvin stuff. So, I mean, still Kiesel stuff now is pretty well priced compared to, say, ordering a custom guitar from like a one-man shop or something like that. But, these are like half the price of something like an Aria, I guess, because they're making them in the States, and they still make most of them in the States, as I understand it. That would take out, say, like import taxes and things like that on Japanese or Korean-made instruments. The only thing that I feel like I'm missing here with the Carvins aren't any pictures. And then we've got all the Charvels. So look at this. You've got a whole bunch of these custom and deluxe models over here with varying prices from $650 up to around the $1,300 mark. Then the Surfcasters and Charvette in there as well. That's pretty interesting. I know what the Surfcasters look like, and it was an interesting thing that kind of ties back into that, early 90s, like looking back to what was 30 or 40 years before that, so like the 60s and the 50s. Then we've got these crazy looking Conklin guitars in here. I'm guessing that's probably the guitar that was built for the guitar player from Great White, Mark Kendall, if I remember their name correctly. Then we've got Court, Dingwall. I didn't know Dingwall had been around for that long. I just associate Dingwall with kind of multi-scale basses, if it's the same company, of course. But yeah, I didn't realize that they've been around since the early 90s. And Conklin I always associate with like 7, 8, 9 string guitars from like the mid 2000s in there. Look at this old wireless system in here. That looks like something you would use, that the kids in Stranger Things would use to defeat some kind of monster. This is cool over here. Look at this. Is this an Epiphone? I think we're on the Epiphone stuff over here. That looks like an ESP, like a lot like an ESP. And it's kind of got the slanted pickup in there. I didn't know Epiphone did Super Strats. It looks like it's got a Gibson 500T in it. That's pretty cool. And no prices listed, which is a shame. Erlewine, Ernie Ball Music Man. So the Edward Van Halen model. That's interesting that it wasn't called, maybe it was called the Wolfgang, but they just hadn't started advertising it as the Wolfgang. $15.99. The Silhouette was considerably cheaper, and the Steve Morse model was a little bit cheaper than that. So yeah, interesting that, I mean, compared to, they probably didn't have really that many guitars on the market there, probably compared to their basses, but you're still kind of paying a premium price for having that Van Halen name attached to it. Then we've got all the ESP stuff. I mean, I'm saying premium, but look at all the ESPs. They're kind of priced around the same as the EVH and up. The George Lynch, $2,000. Okay, I take back what I said. That seems like a pretty good deal there. You get the ultimate 80s Guitar Hero signature guitar, and it's a little bit cheaper than the other ultimate 80s Guitar Hero signature guitar in there, the George Lynch. So that's the base price anyway. It'd be interesting to know what other ones they were making at the time, because I feel like George has just had this ridiculous number of signature instruments. And I saw a discussion on one of the forums that I like to read talking about, YouTubers shilling stuff, and George Lynch's name immediately came up. It's like, well, no one on YouTube can be as bad as George when it comes to signature gear. But you know what? I don't mind that, because when you can play guitar like George Lynch, who cares? George deserves all the signature models that they get for all those glorious licks. What do we have next? Fender. Here we go. So I feel like the 87, 88 version of this, there was like a pretty limited number of Fender guitars, and here it just looks like it has exploded. You've got US Vintage Series, Reissue Series, Standard Series, more Standard Series, Contemporary Series, HRR, Strat Plus, Signature Series. These are just for Strat style guitars as well. The HM Strats are in there, which I think they've actually just reissued. recently. Then you've got a bunch of things for Telecasters, very, very similar things in there. What is happening here? Designer Signature Series, the Diakisto, the Robin Ford model. Those Robin Ford models always looked pretty cool. Robin has a signature PRS now as well. So just kind of curious. Was it the Strat Ultra that Ty Tabor played? Something like that, the one with the push buttons on there. Maybe I'm thinking of the Strat. I'm thinking of the Strat Plus. Oh, I'm going to regret this when I'm sitting here editing it and I've got access to Google and I can figure out exactly what it is. But look, standard Strat, $800. Vintage Strat, $1,100. So not a crazy price differential in there, but the Strat Ultra's $1,449. The Mountstein model, this is obviously not $1.29, must be $12.99. They've put the little commas in the wrong place there. Same price as the Clapton, same price as the Jeff Beck model. So you can see all these signature instruments so far are hovering around that like $1,200, $1,300 to $1,500 range. Obviously, the George Lynch one was a little bit more in there. We just talked about that. But yeah, I mean, I've got an Ingve Strat. I love it. One of my best friends had a Jeff Beck Strat and I actually recorded a lot of tunes on the Ragdoll All I Want record with that. Like if you've listened to Break You, that's a Les Paul for a set of doubles and a Jeff Beck Strat for a set of doubles on there. I love the way that thing sounded. I really should have bought it. I couldn't really justify it at the time, but yeah, looking back, the custom shop Jeff Beck's, they're some of the best Strats out there. And the Ingve Strat is awesome as well. So all those Fenders, and then a bunch of guitars that I've never heard of over here. We've got Gaddon, Fritz Brothers. So, they did the Roy Buchanan Bluesmaster. I think I know what's going on there. Friends guitars. And we're on to the other big American manufacturer, Gibson, over here. Oh, the M3. If anybody owns an M3 or played an M3 back in the day, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, because I don't know, they're just weird looking guitars. Like that Epiphone, this Epiphone Super Strat thing back here. Where were we? That, I don't know, that kind of looks more like thought out and balanced as a design than the M3. The M3 looks, I mean, it's not as bad as that Firebird X or whatever it was, but yeah, interesting. Here we go. Les Paul Custom, $18.49. Classic Plus. The Classic Plus was more than the Custom. That's interesting. And then there's a Custom Plus. I don't know if they did a Custom Plus. I feel like this was the beginning of Gibson adding like Plus, Classic, Premium, all these model numbers to the end. It got really, really confusing. Like my main Les Paul is a Les Paul Standard Premium Plus from 2002 or something like that. These early 90s Les Pauls, though, every single one that I've played, they're really heavy guitars, but they sound amazing and they play really, really great. My dad used to have a Les Paul Limited Colors edition, and it got stolen, and that thing was a beast. I love the way that sounded. I think friend of the channel, Troy Nababan, friend of the Troy channel Nababan. See, I've been talking too long already. Anyway, Troy has an awesome early 90s Les Paul as well that I really like the sound of, and it's a boat anchor. It's so heavy. So yeah, Les Paul Standard, $1,500. Pay an extra $100, you can get an Eddie Van Halen model. They're cheaper than some of the imports. I'm guessing something was going on with tariffs at the time where it was considerably cheaper to get an American-made instrument because you weren't paying those tariffs on there. Very interesting. And oh yeah, what was look at this, Carina Flying V Explorer Collector's Editions. That's pretty cool. Griffin, I have seen some Griffin guitars before. Gretsch, what was a White Falcon? Whoa, okay, yeah, so even compared to like a Les Paul, a White Falcon was kind of a premium price back then. GTX Guild. I've always wanted to try one of the Guild, what are they called? The Bluesbirds. They look like pretty sweet guitars. And then we are on to some more fantastic American-made guitars. Hamer. So I've got a Californian Elite. I think I paid $650 for it in 2012 from a music store in Fort Worth. The very first time I went to the States on tour, and I saw it and I was like, I can't believe it. A Hamer Californian, I got to do it. So they were $1,700 in 1991. And yeah, this just kind of looks like it's describing my guitar. 27 fret rosewood fingerboard, Seymour Duncan pickups. That's awesome. I think mine might have an ebony fretboard though, which is interesting. So maybe it was a custom order or something like that. They got the chaparrals with the Sustainiac. That's awesome. The Centura is quite a lot less than, say, a Californian, which makes sense. They seem like they don't really command huge used prices anymore. The Sunburst, again, like not the best named guitar to call it a Sunburst and then have finishes that aren't Sunburst. I've got a 90, it's either a 91 or a 93 Sunburst in that like salmon blush finish that is immaculate, and I really like that. The Vintage S, I had a Vintage S. Friend of the channel, Ben Wilson, has my Vintage S now. So Ben, if you're watching this, pick up that guitar and give it a little noodle with those magic fingers, mate. This is the best guitar name over here, Hamburg Guitar. Is that like a hamburger guitar, or is it a guitar from Hamburg? These instruments are custom ordered, quality handmade guitars. Okay, that kind of makes sense. All orders include choice of hardware. Where are they made though? I want to say they're probably made in Hamburg, but that's really, really funny. I wish there was a picture of them, or maybe they look like a hamburger. I'm gonna have to look this up later. The mystery is getting to me. Hartfield. Again, I wish there were pictures in here. These sound like they would be cool guitars. They got cool names: Talon, Elon, Heritage. Obviously, the old Gibson factory was, I think, bought by some of the employees or something happened there, but you had Heritage guitars come out of that. Every Heritage I've played is fantastic. If you're a Heritage fan, you're in a safe space here. Weigh in the comments. I know there's a bunch of people who love Hamers as well, so let me know what Hamer you got. Okay, this must have been right around the time the Ibanez Universe came out. So look at this. 7-string, American basswood body, green Damasio Blaze, 2 pickups. This would have been a crazy, crazy time for guitar. You know, you've got Passion and Warfare out. Steve's playing a 7-string guitar, not as some kind of gimmick, but, you know, to get lower tunings on there. This is really where you start to get a lot of, I guess, what we would now consider like modern down-tuned filthy guitar or gent. It all starts to percolate around this time. I'm sure a lot of people's first 7-string was probably a Universe as well, and I'd love to get an original Universe one day. The prices on them used now are understandably quite high. What I didn't understand either back in the day when I was in high school, I thought a Universe and a Gem 77 were the same thing, because like Gem 7, you know? Anybody else think that? Or am I just gifted in that regard? Look at that, monkey grip. Is that the Universe or the Gem? How many strings are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, awesome. They're still one of the best looking 7-string guitars in my opinion. That's kind of the archetype there. So, I mean, you could get, what was a Universe back in the day? $1,700, or the Universe 7. That's pretty cool. $1,500. Cheaper than an Ibanez Red Beach RBM2 Voyager. The one, that one's got Koa, so that kind of makes sense. And then you've got, I guess, the simpler version down there, the Satriani guitars. So all the Ibanez stuff, I can see why people were playing this so much, because they're pretty aggressively priced compared to, say, even the ESP import stuff, and then a lot of the Gibson stuff out there. And they've got this gigantic range. You know, you've got their kind of Roadstar series, you've got the Frank Gabale model, you've got the George Benson series in there. And yes, look at this. This is like a greatest hits of iconic guitars from the late 80s, early 90s. You go from Ibanez straight into Jackson USA and Jackson Professional and Jackson Custom Shop. So the base price for a soloist was $2,300. I've got a buddy in the States who said around this time they were endorsed by Jackson and they had a soloist that they custom ordered and it cost them a bomb. So I can certainly believe that looking at these prices here. I know there's definitely some Jackson fans in the comments as well. The Warriors I always thought were super cool guitars. You know, I remember when I first kind of got into guitar and I sort of discovered like hard rock and metal, I thought the Soloist was one of the coolest guitars of all time, and kind of gone off them just a little bit, but reading about this does definitely make me feel nostalgic. James Tyler, if you haven't seen Michael Nielsen's Dan Huff Tyler signature guitar video, go and watch that. Just the track in it is gorgeous, and there's so many shimmery cleans in there. JB Player, that's a brand I've never heard of. So if there's any JB Player fans in the house, let me know. Then we've got Lotus, that's a cool name for a guitar company. Modulus, oh yeah, they did the Bob Weir guitars. Oscar Schmidt, look at this. PRS, I think in 87, 88 had pretty much one model of the custom. Now, look at this. You've got the EG Bolt-On, the PRS Custom. So a Custom 24 back in 91 was about $200 more than a Wolfgang. So again, getting to that premium price, but cheaper than the base model Jackson Soloist from the Custom Shop. PRS standard. I would love to get a standard one day. All mahogany on a PRS, I don't know, it kind of seems like it goes against the PRS aesthetic of fancy woods, but I like PRS guitars that are kind of plainer looking, and the standard ticks that. Then you've got the special, so essentially a PRS standard, but with a PRS wide thin. Interesting. I never heard of that. The studio, what's the difference there? You can get it with a maple top. All the above features, but with a hot vintage treble humbucker. So they're kind of the same guitars, just with slightly different specs. And then the classic electric, the CE, awesome workhorse guitars. I've got a few buddies with CEs, and they absolutely love them. Then what do we have? Performance guitars, PBC. This is interesting. The Dave Bunker Signature Series Touch Series guitar. I'm guessing, whoa, look at this thing. Double neck instrument that's played with both hands. Play bass and guitar lines, 20 individual hexaphonic pickups. That sounds amazing. I'm guessing it's like a war guitar or a Chapman stick. You've got Peavey. Look at all of this. Little do Peavey know that soon they're going to be making the Van Halen guitar. Pensacola Standard. Yeah, around the same price as like a Jackson Custom Shop. So, I mean, it's interesting to think that, you know, you have to factor all these prices in compared to like wages and cost of living and things like that. So I'm always curious to know, with inflation and then factoring all those things in, if these are roughly kind of priced the same. I'm sure some very, very smart person who knows a lot more about economics than I do could weigh in. Like, you know, a Sir to order it now, sure, the face value would be a lot more, but factoring in wages and factoring in inflation and things like that, probably be a little bit different. Tom Petty, did not expect to see Tom Petty in here. So we got Rick's, Robin guitars. They made some very cool Super Strat style guitars, and thank you to my buddy Alessio for enlightening me about the Robins. It's a shame there's no photos of those in here, because I thought they are some of the kind of best looking Super Strat guitars from that era. What do we have? Sadowski. Sadowski do some very, very nice stuff. Roger is probably better known for their basses, but I have played a Sadowski electric once, and it was a super sweet ride. Steinberger, look at this. This is cool. So is this, what guitar is this? Is this a Squier HM? I think it is. So Squiers, yeah, look, considerably cheaper. I think the most expensive one there is what, $650 for an HM. That's pretty cool. Samick, Sebring, Roscoe, I've never heard of. Oh, they do a double neck. A Strat style double neck. That's pretty interesting. I'm gonna have to look all of these up. What do we have? Tom Anderson Guitar Works. Again, you're in that kind of custom range. So similar prices to a Sir or a Custom Shop Jackson. While I was editing this, I kind of totally forgot to talk about the Steinberger stuff on here. And the thing that really, really surprised me was how expensive the Steinberger stuff was relative to the cost of, I guess, a traditional electric guitar. Like, plenty of them are coming in at around that $3,000 mark, which in the early 90s was a pretty decent chunk of change. You haven't really seen anything else in this particular catalog that really goes over that particular mark. That's 50% more expensive than, say, like the most expensive custom signature model that we looked at, like the George Lynch guitar, around $2,000. And I think that just kind of goes to show, one, how forward-thinking Steinberger was, not only with the design, but like how expensive that design obviously would have been to implement. I doubt that all that extra price is just coming down to the novelty factor on there. Using composite materials and using custom hardware is obviously going to add up. Whereas, like, you know, Gibson are making Gibson bridges that they've pretty much been making since the 50s, and similar stuff for Fender. So I imagine that's where some of that price is coming in. And now, I mean, I always kind of think of like Strandberg as being that, you know, natural evolution of the Steinberger thing on there. That's probably what you might pay for like a made in Indonesia Strandberg model these days. Even though that might seem a little bit on the expensive side, in relative dollars, it's actually a way better deal, because I imagine now that 1991 Steinberger price is probably more akin to like $5 or $6,000 in today's money. Anyway, awkward post-production segue over. Let's get back to the main program. Valley Arts, yes. How much do they have the Luke model in here? They got the Larry Carlton, standard and custom. Steve Lukather model. So Luke's signature guitar was a little bit more expensive than Eddie's signature guitar, and slightly more expensive than George's signature guitar. They're like the holy trinity of amazing 80s guitar players right there. Fireburst, Swamp Ash body, Les Paul scale or Strat scale on there, Bird's Eye maple. Sounds awesome. You know, I was talking about that Hamer Vintage S earlier. That very much had a Valley Arts Luke vibe to it. And yeah, they're another one of my favorite looking guitars from that era. Washburn, we got the N4, the Nuno, the N2. Again, kind of iconic Strat style guitars. I know a few people out there who are probably watching this who love the Nuno guitars. Look at this. The ones that they have, maybe that's a natural finish one. That's probably a natural finish one. I always think of the Nuno guitars and I just think of that natural finish on there. So it's kind of weird seeing one in black. And then we've got Yamaha over here. Look at that. I didn't know that Yamaha did fancy Pacificas. I always think of Pacificas as either like super cheap guitars or surprisingly well spec'd and well priced guitars, like this kind of thing. They're telly style ones in there. So you're going from, what's the most expensive Pacifica in here? About $2,000. So proper premium guitar price, all the way down to about $700. Kind of all the working man's price in there. Appearance by Billy Sheehan over here. This is probably the end of the guitar section. Zion guitars. I think, did Ty Tabor play those for a hot minute or something as well? Or did he play a Zon? I can never remember. Or Zoid. We're in the weeds over here. Zion, Zoid, and Zon. Maybe they're all the same company. So that's just the guitar section in there. That's fairly interesting, you know, comparing this to, say, that 87, 88 version and looking at some of the prices. I feel like the base price of a decent electric guitar had kind of gone up a little bit, but maybe the gap at the top wasn't as wide. I also feel like, you know, it was probably more accentuated in the early 90s than it was in the early 2000s when I was learning guitar, but felt like when I was learning guitar, there wasn't that much of a difference in like quality between a $500 and a $1,500 guitar. Whereas now, with what you can get, you know, a $500 guitar, you can get an instrument that you can actually go and gig with, and then a $1,500 guitar, you can get something that feels really, really premium. So it's like that kind of spectrum. Instead of having like 3 price points and actual points of difference, now it's almost like this continuum of what would you like. And that's also kind of why there's so many people like myself on here, you know, either reviewing gear and saying, well, look, you can spend $20 more and have these features, or spend $30 less and have these features. It's all pretty good. And it sounds like a cop-out that it is all pretty good, but it is all pretty good. You know, back in the day, this is all you had. You know, you might look at that guitar and go, you know what? What is this? A Picasso? That's a wonderful pun. That's definitely the guitar I want. And then save up, you know, $2,500 and order it and get it, and maybe be blown away by it, maybe be pretty unimpressed with it. There were kind of fewer ways to know, because you can only really read about them, and maybe you were lucky and you had a buddy who went and got one of them or something like that. Or you went into a music store. Remember those things? You probably couldn't go into a music store for these custom orders, but you could definitely go into a music store and, you know, try out, you know, probably some Hamers and some Gibsons and some Gretsch's and some Fenders and things like that. I mean, look at the range of all the Fender stuff. It's just exploded from the 80s, and that would be catering to having those options in a music store. All right, I'm gonna have a sip of my tea, and we should look at amps and effects next. Straight up, the very first thing listed in the amp section, ADA MP1 MIDI tube preamp, $800. And then they've got the T100S tube power amp for $950, or you can get the bipolar stereo power amp for $750. So you could kind of put together this amazing switchable rig with 3 different channels for under $2,000, or almost around, yeah, under $2,000. Let's say that. I was going to say around the 1,500 mark if you went for something like this, but we'll go all tube with this. You would need a switcher to go with it as well. But, you know, compared to just like a single channel Marshall that does one sound, albeit one pretty good sound, you'll be the coolest kid on your block with that particular setup. And I love this ad here for the Hafler Triple Giant, designed by Bogner. I hope they have that listed in here. Did everybody in the early 90s just wear like acid wash denim, some snakeskin shoes, and have a guitar with some cigarette butt marks on it? If you were around then, is this what you wore, or was this just kind of what you would roll your eyes at? So I love that they've got the ADA stuff in there and the bass preamp in there. Then there's, oh, look at this, a split stack guitar cabinets. That's not too bad, you know, $469.95. So you get 2 of them. What's that? $900, and you've got a stereo quad box that you can kind of separate out. So yeah, for around the $3,000 mark, you can go all in and have a wicked ADA rig, and again be the coolest kid on the block. I guess that's quite a lot of money for back in the day. But we'll see. We'll contrast this with, say, like what a Marshall or a Boogie costs in there. So animal amps. What are these? What is an animal amp? Practice amps from the looks of things. They are very, very cheap in there. The BBE, not a sonic maximizer, but the BBE preamp. Mono preamp for bass or guitar. Oh, it looks like it's kind of got some of that stuff in there. So, yep, I'll leave all BBE commentary aside. But look at this, Bogner Fish. So twice the price of an ADA. Handmade 4-channel all-tube preamp with 3 different voice EQ sections. That's pretty wild. And then they've got, so this is still Bogner, the 1600 series, the 1200 series. I'd never heard about these before. I always think of Bogner and I think of the Fish, and then I think of the Ecstasy and the Uberschall. So probably a little bit before that time. And again, Carvin are in here. So you can see they've got, what was the X100B? $579. So I can see why a bunch of people were using Carvin stuff at the time as well, because like that's a full head for less than the cost of an 88 MP1 in there. And again, I think Carvin were just kind of selling direct and churning stuff out of the American factory, which it kind of makes sense. That's why they could keep the prices down. Dean Markley amps. I've been so curious about these for a long time, especially, what one was it? I feel like they had some kind of amp, yeah, over here. The DMC-80 Dreammaker. So it had stereo chorus, which is pretty cool. So maybe kind of like a Roland JC120 sort of vibe in there. And then we've got Demeter, classic Demeter preamp, the TGP3, one that I've never tried, one that I would love to. I think Dean DeLeo used one of those as part of their kind of the STP Rigadoon, as a lot of people would know. Metalhead, wow. What are these? Rack mount tube power amps, Mark II preamp. That's cool. I'd never heard of these. Were these, they made a rack mountable wah? What? Never even heard of this brand before. Kind of looks cool. Did anybody ever hear about this company? Elon Metalhead? Maybe I have to go on Reverb and start looking around for some stuff. Engel digital lamps. Interesting. I didn't know that Engel did digital stuff. Maybe they never did. Maybe it was just very, very switchable. Fender. Look at these names. The Rad, the Hot, the Jam. That's amazing. Again, without photos, I don't know what we're looking at. Yeah, look at these. This is that era of Fenders in there. Power Chorus. 2 channels with switching, pre and post distortion, EQ, reverb. Kind of sounds like their take on a Boogie or something like that. I wonder if that was all tube. They got their vintage reissue in here. This is very, very 80s and early 90s. The number of things that have stereo chorus built into them. The ADA, that Dean Markley thing. There's some Fender stuff in here. Bass combos, bass heads, Jewel Showman. That's kind of cool. So look at this, M80 chorus, 65 watts per channel, stereo amp, 2 channels with switching, stereo chorus, contour control. Very, very curious. I'd never really heard about those. If anybody had one of these stereo Fender combos back in the day, you know where to leave a comment. GK, ooh, is this the era when GK made guitar preamps in here? Look at this, yes. The 100 MPL MIDI guitar preamp. What was the one? Like the one. So they made lead cabinets and power amps. I think GK are more renowned as like a bass company, but what was it? The 250, 260. Yeah, look at these. That's awesome. The ML250. I feel like that was a guitar one. It's not listed in here. Maybe it came out earlier. I guess because that was what Iron Maiden Summer in Time or Seventh Son, they were using those. Gibson Labs. This is pretty cool. Gibson's new amp division, the Classic Gold, the Gold Chorus. Yep, I think Gibson, did they acquire Lab Series around this time? And that's why it kind of became their new amp division. Kind of like they've acquired Boogie recently. Groove Tubes. I feel like these were those tiny little preamps that you could get, and then they did the Groove Tubes Trio preamp, which look cool. Now, there's no photos of them in here, but I've never tried one. And here we go. Look. Here's the Hafler Triple Giant. So that was $1,000 compared to, what was the Fish? $1,600 or something like that. And I imagine we'll get a similar thing with those Yamaha T-Series amps and the Soldanos. Very interesting. Harry Colby, single rack space tube guitar preamp. Another company that I'd never heard of. Hartkey and Samson were doing stuff. Here we go. Kasha, they did the Rock Mod. Here we go. What was a Rock Mod? The Rock Mod 2, $800. So like ADA price, but not programmable like the 88. Oh, they did the Rock Mod 3. They got the Quick Mod. This is awesome. I actually recently watched Michael Nielsen's Rock Mod video in there, and I thought it sounded pretty good. H&K, here we go. Yep, the Bluesmaster Tube preamp. You're not allowed to play anything except blues. You're not allowed to play anything except Cream songs on the Cream machine. You're not allowed to play any grunge songs on the Metal Shredder Tube amp. These names. I don't know. Has anything got better with this kind of gear? I feel like now it's just kind of they take some kind of, constellation, and that becomes the name of the product, or yeah, something like that. Laney's, KMD. So what were Laney doing around the time? The AORs or something? Looks like there's none of those listed. Maybe this was one of those dark days of Laney amps kind of things. Marshall, here we go. Here we go. The JTM 45 reissue, the Blues Breaker reissue. I'm fairly certain that my JTM 45 is probably from around this era, like early 90s. And then you've got the JCM 900s have come in here. So what was the JCM 900 back in the day? No prices listed. Right. And they had the 9000 series, and they had the Valve State series. Wow. So it's crazy to think that now the 8100 is like a 31-year-old amp, kind of cult death metal amp these days. Plague Scythe Studios just put up a really great video with that. I'm just going to be shouting out everybody whose videos I've been watching recently. And then we get onto Boogie. I feel like so far, this is all gear I'm really familiar with. Like I've demoed a bunch of this stuff like the ADAs, and we get into the Boogies. So look, we have the Mark IV, 3 independent modes, all tube, graphic EQ, reverb, constant or switchable loops, 7 preamp and 3 power amp voicing switches, $1,600. Not a bad price considering everything that you get in there. I got really, really fortunate when I bought mine to actually pay not much more than that. So I feel like I got a great deal on that. That's for the combo. The head was over here, $1,470, which is pretty cool. And that's right, because you could get the little stereo satellite head to go with it. So that was just a power amp that you could do things with, which was pretty cool. And the Studio Pre was $600. So cheaper than an ADA MP1. Not programmable, but with the Studio Pre, you get it for that sound. And the quad was, the quad was $1,200. That's quite a lot more. Wow. Of course, the Triaxis was out in 1991. So kind of I would argue the king of the programmable MIDI preamps. And ADA did like 3 sounds, but really you got the ADA for the high gain Marshall sound, maybe that compressed clean. And the tube clean was okay. It's really cool on the modded version that I've got, but yeah, for those kind of 2 modes. But then the Triaxis, I feel like everything on the Triaxis is super usable and super awesome. It's probably the greatest of all time when it comes to those programmable tube preamps in there. So, I mean, for that and a stereo 50-50, $2,000, that's a pretty impressive rig to put together. Like not that much more than an ADA MP1 and the ADA tube power amp. And yeah, the Triaxis, I mean, it's held up pretty well in my opinion. If you're a Triaxis owner, let me know in the comment section below. We got Nady, we got Passac, we got Peavey. Interesting. I wonder if Peavey were doing, doesn't really look like they were doing anything super high end. Stereo Chorus 212, micro bass. There's a bunch of cheap stuff in here, a bunch of like mid-tier stuff. Interesting. Pendulum, that's an acoustic preamp. Pignose, $100, get a Pignose. They're probably worth more money than that nowadays, which is kind of funny. And then Randall in here have a pretty good selection. So look at this, 125 watt. 125, that's got to be better than 100. All tube head with switchable channels. I wonder who was designing these in here. And then you got a bunch of their solid state stuff as well. Then Rocktron, of course, we're doing preamps at the time. Roland have the classic Roland amps in here. Rolls, half rack space preamp. Interesting. There's some interesting kind of budget stuff in here. Oh, I missed this over here. Rivera, they were doing their stereo combo. Stereo rack amps, all tube stereo rack mount amp with 2 channels, 2 effects loops, and dual spring reverb. That is pretty interesting in there. You have 2 different spring reverbs. That would have been ridiculously noisy if you were rolling around with that in your car. Interesting. Yeah, Allen Holdsworth juice extractor. I know some people still use those, so they've held up pretty well. Seymour Duncan, the convertible. That was interesting. Was that I feel like that was a Seymour Duncan amp they did with like a graphic EQ that was pre-gain and a graphic EQ that was post-gain, and guitar players just went, this is too hard. We don't understand how it works. THD, they made the iconic hot plate, probably a lot of people's first attenuator. VHT, here we go, Stephen Fryette in the house. Look at this, we've had like all the classic revered amp builders, Revera, VHT, Bogner. We'll get on to, did we have Soldano in here? Did I miss Soldano? I did miss Soldano. Custom amps, yes, hello. $2,000, and the X88R preamp was even more expensive than a Fish, so $1,900. That's a lot of money to throw towards a preamp. Was it MIDI programmable? All tube, 3 different channels. Doesn't say. I can't remember if the X88 is MIDI programmable, but yeah, this is, we've had like all my favorite things, like the Soldano stuff, the 80A MP1, the Boogie Mark IV, the Boogie Studio Pre. I haven't seen the Kitty Hawk stuff listed in here, which maybe that was kind of like a Euro only thing in there. VHT, I didn't realize that they did a Pitbull Tube MIDI preamp. Never heard of that. I always just thought it was a head in there. I would love to get a Fryette one day, even if it's just a deliverance, just to have that sound. I feel like the VHT and the Fryette stuff has this amazing, uncompromising bark about it. And I love Steve's videos and the live streams that they do on there when they're just having a good time, having a few drinks, telling some stories. It's pretty awesome. Here we go. Here's the Yamaha stuff. So the T100C. So look, what, $800 less than the actual Soldano. T100 is the rack mountable version, list for $1,099. Oh, that's a combo. Okay, there we go. T50C. So yeah, you can see why Soldano would have gone with Yamaha and said, hey, you can manufacture things. I'll design you something, and you're not going to be eating my lunch, because if people want a Soldano, they want it custom ordered, but you're making that sound much more widely available, kind of like the Jet City stuff is these days. So yeah, this is fascinating. Basses. Do we need to look at basses? There's like 3 bass guitars that anyone's ever cared about, really. And then we've got effects in here. And look, we start with Alesis. We saw that ad earlier with the Alesis, the Quadriverb GT91. I mean, look, you got to give them props for being ballsy with their advertising, but yeah, maybe not commanding the mass respect that a 57 Strat does these days. Although, were they still making the MIDI-Verb 2 at the time? I mean, this is fairly reasonably priced stuff. Like I said, $500 for a Quadriverb Plus or $400 for a MIDI-Verb. That'll do most of what you need to do to go and play in clubs with your 80A rig or your Boogie or something like that. Art, we're putting stuff out. I feel like the Art or ART Ultrafoot is still a pretty desirable little MIDI controller. It can do a lot of things on there. Look at this, BBE Sonic Maximizer. Is it the greatest thing ever made, or is it the worst thing ever made? I had a BBE at one stage, and when I started playing with bands, yeah, that's kind of around the time that I stopped using it. So I know some people swear by them, and if it works for you, it works for you. But it was just giving me the old scoopies, a little bit more than I like the old scoopies to happen in my sound over there. Look at all these Boss effects over here. What was a Metal Zone in 1991? $140. But then you could get, whoa, look at this. The HM2 was $100. SD1, $90. So street price. If anybody was buying this stuff back in the day, please let me know what you can remember the street prices of these being. I've been talking for too long. I'm even getting sick of the sound of my own voice. There's some kind of rare Boss stuff in here, like the PQ4 is a super rare Boss pedal now. They command crazy prices used. The high band flanger is in there. Yeah, DC3. So this all feels like modern Boss. Chandler, look at this. The Digital Echo. Did Clifton Wright have a video with that? I'll have to check in with them. I feel like that's a pretty kind of classic delay from that era. Here we go. Digitech. The pitch shifter, the IPS, $900. DSP 16, DSP 256. So I've got a DSP 128 that my dad bought new back in the day. I wonder if that's listed on here. That'd be kind of crazy. Look at all this programmable EQs, and I feel like the Digitech stuff was alongside like the Alesis stuff as well as, like, if you just want stuff that works, that isn't eventide prices, then you're probably going to have a pretty good time. Look at this, the Damasio Very Metal pedal. I feel like somebody asked me about that on my Friday Q&A recently, and I'd never heard of it. So very, very interesting that Damasio made at least one pedal. And of course, DoD. If you couldn't afford the Boss stuff, it feels like the DoD stuff was a little bit more affordable. Although you're kind of getting to similar levels in here. The FX68 Super Stereo Chorus, the FX60 Stereo Chorus. Yeah, they're probably maybe like 60-70% of the price of the Boss stuff in there. Dunlop cranking out stuff again. MXR are back in here. You can see the classic MXR lineup, Phase 90, the Dynacomp. I mean, reading the 80s version of this, it kind of felt like a different era. With this, I'm just seeing so many things that I recognize in here. Like you're seeing, Fishman have their acoustic blender in here. And of course, Fishman make loads of stuff now, like pickups that are really well regarded and still make acoustic things in there. Here we go. The Eventide H3000 was $2,500 in 1991, and the expansion card was an extra $1,000. And the XLR to quarter-inch adapters with a 10 dB pad was $75 on there. This is wild. That was a lot of money back in the day. Again, especially compare it to like a few Boss effects or the Digitech stuff or the Elisa stuff, and you can see why so many people just had a quadriverb in their rack. This was kind of reserved for, I guess, that upper echelon of touring or studio musician in there. So yeah, anyway, this kind of feeling pretty modern. Here we go. The Korg A3. I've got one of those sitting in the rack behind me. Really, really fun unit. So $1,000 still, that's double the price of a quadriverb in there. It's a pretty cool thing. And now it obviously has that association with the Edge for a few things. What else do we have in there? The GSP-21 Pro by Digitech. There we go. I think they did a Legend series of that as well. Morley. We've got MIDI Man. We've got the original Marshall Governor in here. This is interesting. Again, it's kind of feeling very, very much like early 90s. Gear hit this saturation point and not much has changed since then. What do we have? Proco are making the Rat. What's this? The DB1 connects unbalanced instruments to low Z balance lines. Okay, so it's a DI box in there. Now, I've seen a few people talk about these and I've been really fascinated about them. PV multi-effects units from back in the early 90s. So you had the Pro effects, the multi-effects, the ultraverb, the adverb, and the univerb. So the univerb's pretty cheap. That feels like if you wanted to get into rack stuff, that looks like a good deal. But then all the way up to the multi-effects contains 4 16-bit digital multi-effects modules, one 19-inch rack mount package. Each module delivers user-adjustable echo, pre-delay, early reflections. So reverb, in other words. You got some delays, some chorus, all those kind of things. Be very interested to try and get my hands on one of those one day, especially because I'm so familiar with one of my favorite units ever, the Rocktron IntelliFX, which was $1149 back then. That's like existing in its own price tier. Not quite Eventide level, but considerably more than, say, again, the Elisa stuff or the ART stuff. And I mean, the IntelliFX still sounds amazing today. One of the few units to have analog drive-through, and Rocktron were, when did the timeline come out? 2011? I feel like Rocktron were at least 2 decades ahead of everybody else when it came to the idea of like, hey, have your high quality digital stuff, but have analog drive-through on there so it's not going to mess with people's tones. So they don't need to use a line mixer to get the most out of their guitar effects. Absolutely one of the greatest rack effects units ever made. It's in my top 5, along with things like the H3000 and the 2290. Then we got all the Roland stuff. So they were up to the GP16. I think the GP16 was digital, whereas the GP8 was analog. The RSP, that was their, Roland's version of multi-dimensional sound stuff. You had the GK, you had the GR50 out at the time. Whoa, $1,549 for a guitar synth back then. Now you can get the little SY1 and you don't even need a GK pickup, and it probably tracks and sounds a little bit better in there. Tech 21 Sounds Amp. I mean, really, what more do you need in your life, especially if you're a bass player? That just does the thing. TubeWorks, did they do the real tube driver? There's a whole thing with the tube driver in there, but tube driver pedal, $100. That's a pretty good price in there. Then they got the real tube rack. I feel like maybe Chandler, there was some litigation thing or something around there. The Yamaha FX900, I've also got one of those as well. So interesting to know that was pretty similar price to like the most expensive Rocktron stuff in there. I mean, you can do 4 simultaneous effects, We went from the SPX90, which did multi-effects, but one at a time, to 5-6 years later, now you can do 4 at the same time for not much more money. And then the Zoom 9000 series in here. Whoa, oh my Lord, look at that. Zoom 9010, $2,000. What can you do? Up to 7 effects are usable at once. Okay, that would have been a turn on for a lot of people, but I didn't realize Zoom did super premium stuff. Like that's almost eventide price. I mean, you again, the H3000, you can only kind of run one algorithm at once. I love this Rockman ad over here as well. The new low noise Rockman XPR and XP100A. That's awesome. Then we get on to pickups. I don't think I'm going to do pickups for this video because I have probably rambled on long enough. But this particular magazine, this kind of made me feel at home because so much of the retro rack stuff that I've done comes from here. I mean, the Studio Pre, the 80A MP1, the IntelliFX, the Korg A3, like so much of my favorite stuff that I love about the old school rack things seem to be in this particular catalog, which is a bit of an eye-opener. So again, if you had one of these or used to buy these and collect them and lust over them, you were scared of your parents finding these under your bed as opposed to, you know, scared of them finding the Playboys or whatever you might have had, or if you've hung on to these, let me know in the comments. This was a whole lot of fun. Thanks for listening to me ramble on. Maybe we've learned something today. Maybe we haven't. Maybe we've just learned that, you know, the quest for new and beautiful sounding and shiny guitar gear goes on and on. It was rack gear back in 1991. It's a bunch of pedals these days. This was fun. I'm going to plug some of my old rack stuff in now and appreciate that it would have been inaccessible for so many people back in the day, and that, you know, that golden age of rack gear might have been a golden age in terms of what you could start to do, but probably not a golden age in terms of accessibility. Now you could spend, you know, way less money than that and have way more sounds. Like, you know, for $1,000 US, again, you can get an FM3 and you can have like the greatest guitar sounds in the world, all these effects at once, incredible versatility. Whereas back then, $1,000 might not have got you too much. It might have got you like a preamp or something like that that was high quality, and you needed the rest of the rig to go with it. So thanks so much for watching the video. If you like what I'm doing on the channel, there's a bunch of ways you can support me in the video description. Have a great day, and thanks so much for going on this little nostalgia trip with me. If you want me to do more of these, let me know, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.